Hello, and welcome to this discussion of Letter from Beirut by composer Jennifer Stevenson, with text by Lori Badikian. I'm Dr. Jennifer Piazza-Pick, and am currently lecturer of voice and oral skills at Georgia College, and am also one of the founders of Whistling Hens, a chamber ensemble devoted to performing works by women composers. My co-founder, Dr. Natalie Groom, is clarinet professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and the manager of advancement operations and analytics at Washington Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. Our name, Whistling Hens, was inspired by a music critic of Lily Boulanger, who said, "Women composers are at best whistling hens." Our collaborator today is composer Jennifer Stevenson. Not only is she an accomplished orchestral and chamber musician, she's also a highly decorated composer, receiving commissions from artists around the globe. Natalie and I just met Jennifer this past year. Whistling Hens was the ensemble in residence and recipient of the call for scores for the Darkwater Women in Music Festival at UNC Pembroke. Jennifer wrote this beautiful work for us for the composition competition, and not only did she win first place at the festival, but also in our hearts. It's a piece Natalie and I both love for its musical expressiveness and soulful text, and we actually just finished recording it for our debut album, which will be released in the fall of this year. This is Jennifer Stevenson's setting of Lori Badikian's poem, Letter from Beirut. Thank you, Jennifer, for writing us such a moving piece. For those of you here today, I hope that you felt the depth of emotion that we felt when we were performing it. Jennifer, can you tell us some of the background of this piece?
Sure. So, as you had said before, the piece was written on a poem by my friend Lori Bedikian, and her family is part of the Armenian diaspora. And so, when I was creating the piece, I really wanted to tie into that, and I chose to do that in two different ways. First, when I was writing the clarinet part, I wanted to imitate some of the ornamentation and the feeling that you might get from listening to duduk. Duduk is this gorgeous, ancient, throaty reed instrument. And the ornamentation is, it's similar to sort of classical Western canon ornamentation, but it has its own unique flavor. The second way that I wanted to tie in, I wanted to use a lullaby. I've always been drawn to lullabies because I feel like they have such a depth of feeling, and they're often really, really sad. But I think it has to do with how vulnerable you feel as a caretaker of an infant. It's just a really strong art form. And I felt like using a lullaby would immediately tie to kind of that depth of feeling, that vulnerability, but also give it a sense of place. So I asked my friend Lori to give me an example of a lullaby that, her grandmother sang to her and that she sang to her boys. She has twins who at the time would have been, I think, 6. And so she sent me a clip of this beautiful lullaby that we're going to play a little bit for you. So I heard it and I loved it. And I said, Lori, that's great. But what I really want is how your grandmother sang it to you and how you sing it to your children. And so I got this completely adorable voicemail with lots of giggling and false starts, and then her singing that first line. And it was just so raw and so heartfelt that gave me what I needed to sort of dive into the piece emotionally. So that's some of what I was feeling as I started writing the piece, but I was curious as to how you encountered it emotionally when you first started going through it or looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll chime in here. I think it's interesting you say that because it strikes me in hearing this now that we knew none of this before we learned the piece because we learned this as part of the composition competition. And we didn't really interact much with the composers before making the recording to try to keep our interpretation fresh and unbiased before the winner was selected. I mean, you had provided us with program notes, but I just didn't really already have a sound concept like what you just described in my head already. Even without knowing any of that, though, I do remember the first time hearing the piece, since you had a recording that you submitted with your sample, I believe, and I was so deeply moved and honestly sad and hurt hearing this setting. It was one of the most profound things I've ever experienced. You might imagine that as a clarinetist, I'm not spending my whole days thinking about text and being concerned with that, but this one really stood out to me in every way. It's so simple in a lot of ways, but it's just really mournful and sincere. I I mean, I know Lebanon is not Afghanistan, but especially after the Taliban took over again, the grief in this piece, Letter from Beirut, always kind of makes me think of that. Both the text and the clarinet part express that sorrow and hopelessness, and it's a piece that helps me, I feel, express emotions that I can't seem to quite effectively put into words. reading the part itself the first time, I do remember thinking that it needed to have a little bit like more Middle Eastern or kind of a klezmer feel. And so that's how I decided to incorporate vibrato, which is also based on the suggestion in the program notes. I had never heard the duduk before now, and thinking about how I might interpret this next time, I can imagine the clarinet tone being a little bit wider and more quarter tone y the next time we perform it. But all that being said, I'm really curious of what my duo partner thought of the text, hearing that for the first time or reading it for the first time.
Well, I mean, this text is obviously incredibly moving, and it's hard not to like get it caught in your throat with a little bit of emotion, especially when Jennifer told us that that opening music was a lullaby that the poet sings to her children. I gotta admit, it took me a couple of times through after learning that to be able to sing it and not feel choked up. It really changed the way I wanted to sing it. Much of this music, from my perspective, moves in an almost recitative like way. Jennifer's, of course, written out all of the pitches and rhythms, but most of the time, this text really flows the way we would speak. And I think that's reflective of the fact that this poem is a letter. Because it's speech like, it really stays sort of mid voice for the tessitura. I'm often singing right around A4, and the pitches don't really rise unless the text is getting really agitated or frightened. And I think it's especially noteworthy that that final line about how quiet it is actually builds up to a forte high A5. It's expressive of that terror that the speaker is feeling about the silence. And the ending of that phrase is my favorite part of the piece personally, the strike of a match, followed by silence, and then that low flutter tongue pitch in the clarinet. Um, when we were rehearsing, I remember hearing Natalie play that flutter tongue for the first time, and I remember thinking this is the flame igniting. So I really wanted to play with that final CH of match. I like to think of it as the striking of the match. You know, when you, and then there's silence before, and the clarinet's that bursting into flame. And then that final section's really interesting because the clarinet's the lead voice, and I get to be the accompaniment, which of course is difficult for me as a soprano. Um, but I do love that Natalie's supposed to sound very improvisatory, so it's a nice challenge for me to listen to her and adjust my downbeats to the emotional push and pull that she does with the tempo.
Yeah, when I was writing the piece, I really wanted both performers to feel like they were soloists, like they had some real rock star moments. I don't like to write, I write a lot of chamber music, I should say, and I don't like to write pieces that feel like anybody is the accompaniment, even when I'm writing for solo instrument and piano. I had a very intelligent accompanist point out to me that the Brahms clarinet sonatas in the Urtext edition, it says sonata for piano and clarinet, not for clarinet and piano. And that struck me because, you know, Brahms knew a thing or two, and he wrote those very late in his life. And it's a beautiful piano piece with a little bit of clarinet. And so when I've gone into my composing, I'm always trying to, you know, make sure nobody feels like they're getting just, you know, just some plunky low notes or something, that they always have some moments in the piece. For the text setting, like you were talking about the poem, as I went into it, Lori has this amazing way of keeping her poems metered. Not so that you feel, you know, da-da, 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 but so that the emotion is metered out. Everything is, it is building to something, it is building to a climax in a very musical way. And so I knew that I wanted to keep everything contained. And that line, the strike of a match, that's what pulled me into the poem. That was what made me think, oh, people need to hear this. And I actually composed backward from that moment, because I knew that needed to be the climax. It was in the poem as it was written. It needed to be the highest note. It needed to be the most discordant. And then we needed to have just dead silence. So everything working up to that had to have clarinet and soprano, you know, together. What I wanted to be careful of, though, was with clarinet, part of the reason it's so clarinety is it has this amazing set of overtones that's completely unique to the instrument. And I knew I couldn't have Natalie and Jennifer in a range together where those overtones would be clashing, or no matter what Jennifer did, you weren't going to understand the words. I wasn't going to repeat anything. I was going to have it go just as the poem goes. So you only got one shot. If you don't understand it the first time, you don't get it. So what I chose to do was to set the clarinet in our most awful range. It's called the throat tones. Think of like a wolf note on a string instrument, only for us, it's just always there. It's where our register break is. And it's where the clarinet sounds the most muffled. We don't have those ringing overtones right in that little range. So when you're hearing most of the text, you're hearing the clarinet in that throat tones range. And then hopefully I gave, enough other sparkly bits that the clarinetists will all forgive me for putting them in the throat tones, so much for the time. The one exception to that is where you are reaching up to the climax, where I set the clarinet higher and you do get more sort of those overtone clashes and those tartini tones buzzing in your ear. And then at the very end, I chose to end on a major second. I like to do that. It's kind of a creepy, sad thing because it's like, happy birthday, you've done something very, very sad and then you're going to end and you're not going to resolve it for the audience. In some ways that's a little bit cruel as a composer because then people are like, but the poem really demanded that I leave something unsettled at the end of it so that you had to keep thinking about it, that it didn't just sum itself up, because the poem definitely does not do that for you. As far as activism in music, when 9/11 happened, that really, it kind of set me on life tilt. I was in my master's, I was, practicing clarinet all day, learning how to go squeak squawk on this instrument. And it hit me like, what am I doing for the world? What am I doing for humanity here? And I had lots of friends who said, oh, music is healing. And it just seemed sort of glib. I was like, well, antibiotics are healing. Like, how is music healing? But what I've learned through lots of little life detours is that if you can study to become a musician, you are also studying to learn how to listen. And if you can learn how to listen very well, then you can tell stories, other people's stories. And when they hear that, they can connect to that emotionally. And I think we've all felt that as people. Like, you can feel completely isolated and alone, but you hear a song and you're like, that's my feel, right? And that person understands me, that person gets me, and that strengthens you and that bolsters you. And then that gives you more power in your life to go confront whatever else it is whatever injustice it is that you're dealing with there. This piece, it deals with something very specific. And if it causes people to go look up more like about the Armenian genocide, please go look up more about the Armenian genocide. That's wonderful, that's great. But it also touches on something very universal. And it's this feeling that when you're acclimated to trauma, it is the quiet moments that are the most terrifying. It's waiting for the other shoe to drop. We have a really clumsy, bad saying for what this feeling is. And Laurie managed to catch it so eloquently. And that's why I wanted to then, I wanted to set it and have more people hear it, because I knew more people could connect to it that way. And that's sort of how I'm realizing my need in music, to help heal people, to strengthen people.
Yeah, I jump in here and say that everything you've said about activism in text and music really resonated with me. Um, and I really have nothing to add about that, just because I would say the same things, but a little bit more clumsily. Like I said earlier, this piece is definitely a way for me to express feelings that I can't quite seem to put into words. Really, a lot of the work we do with Whistling Hens, I think, is also my way of saying things that are in my head, about artistic expression and advocacy, because I had a similar moment to you, Jennifer, in 2017 after the election, where I almost quit clarinet because I felt really hopeless, particularly as it related to rights for women. I felt like what I was doing, playing clarinet 3 to 6 hours a day, that's time that could have maybe been better spent, like volunteering for Planned Parenthood, or helping women move quickly and safely to shelters, or helping children who are in abusive families. I mean, I definitely also think music is healing, but I also wanted to feel like I had a direct hand in improving people's lives, which sometimes music doesn't do, particularly where I've found there's this attitude, sometimes maybe in the instrumental music world, of like, I will put on a concert and people will come. I feel it's a very bystandery and inactive way of living, and thinking of kind of the community as this us and them, like the musician is outside, the community is out there. So finding Whistling Hens as an outlet, that was one of the ways that I felt like I brought meaning and purpose back into my musical life. And the other beautiful thing about this is right now we're also uh, examples of how music is connecting people, how it connected us, because we were literally on opposite ends of the country, Los Angeles to DC. And now we're getting to know each other for the first time through this recital. I think that's really special. And yeah, it's something that I want to hold on to.
I think playing off of part of what your mission is as an ensemble. I mean, that definitely drew me to you. I throughout my professional life, I've tried to make sure we're incorporating pieces that are underrepresented. You know, that, like you were saying, especially with classical music, we go like, oh, we have this canon, and we play these pieces out of this canon, and this is why people come to us. It's like, well, we could also, I don't know, go to people. We could play in unusual places. We could do surprising and creative things, because it is about connecting. And it takes a little intentionality and a little extra effort, but to find those pieces that have not been played, to find those composers and help work with them to create pieces that are what you need to connect to different communities. That's such an important part of music making, that I think, you know, they don't really teach you that in conservatory. You know, we have this connection here. When I saw the composition competition, I knew it was going to be for you too. And so I immediately started internet stalking you. Like, I watched everything on your website and I watched all of your YouTube videos. And I just wanted to know everything I could about you, because I wanted to create a piece that you would love. And I also wanted to honor what I wanted to do with Lori's poem, because she was my friend. You know, I met her in the kindergarten walk-up line waiting for her kids. I didn't know she was a genius. I knew she was hilarious and awesome. And then I read her book, and it smacked me in the face, and it was just beautiful. But writing music to set her poem, in some ways it was easier because she was my friend and I could talk to her about it. But it was also harder because it was like her baby, you know, and I'm holding it. Like, don't drop the baby, right? But taking those risks and reaching out and creating music with other people in the now, like, that is so fulfilling to me. And you know, I knew from seeing your website that it was going to be something that would be fulfilling for you also, and you know, to create this moment where there's 4 women trying to say this really important thing. I have loved every minute of this experience.
We're at the end of our time together, but I hope you'll continue the discussion with us outside of this pre-recorded lecture, because we love nothing more than talking about what we do and helping others find their musical fulfillment. You can find us at whistlinghens.com, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And you can always send us an email as well. We'd love to chat with you anytime. Thanks for being here tonight, and have a wonderful day.